I'm still shaking as I write this, and it's been 3 weeks since that night at Cleveland General Hospital. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but I swear on everything I hold dear that every word is true. I've never been the same since that night, and honestly, I don't think I ever will be. Let me know in the comments if you've ever explored an abandoned hospital, because after what happened to me, I need to know I'm not alone in this. My name is David, and I'm a 28-year-old photography student living in Cleveland, Ohio. For the past 2 years, I've been passionate about urban exploration. You know, exploring abandoned buildings, documenting decay, capturing the haunting beauty of forgotten places. I've been to dozens of abandoned locations, factories, schools, shopping malls, even a few houses. But I'd never attempted anything as ambitious as Cleveland General Hospital. The massive red brick building sits on the east side of Cleveland, surrounded by a rusty chain-link fence that's been cut through in several places over the years. The hospital closed in 2008 after serving the community for over 80 years, and since then, it's become a magnet for urban explorers, vandals, and according to local legends, something much worse. I'd been planning this exploration for months. The building is enormous. 7 floors of medical wards, operating rooms, administrative offices, and the infamous psychiatric wing that occupies the entire 4th floor. What drew me to Cleveland General wasn't just its size or architectural significance. It was the stories I'd heard from other explorers about strange encounters, unexplained sounds, and the feeling of being watched in certain areas of the hospital. Hit the like button if this story is already giving you chills, because what I experienced there was beyond anything I could have imagined. The night I chose was a Friday in October 13th to be exact. I know it sounds like I was asking for trouble, but that date was purely coincidental. I wasn't alone on this adventure. I was with my 2 best friends, Marcus and Sarah. Marcus is a fellow urban explorer who's been doing this longer than I have, and Sarah is a journalism student who wanted to document our exploration for a story she was working on. We met at my apartment around 10 p.m., loaded our backpacks with cameras, flashlights, portable LED lights, and first aid supplies. The plan was simple: enter through the loading dock area where the fence had been cut, make our way to the main entrance, and systematically explore each floor, starting from the ground level and working our way up. The drive to the hospital took about 20 minutes through Cleveland's east side neighborhoods. As we got closer, the urban landscape became increasingly desolate. Abandoned houses with boarded windows, empty lots filled with weeds, and the occasional flickering streetlight created an atmosphere that felt like a horror movie set. When we finally pulled up to the hospital, my first reaction was how imposing it looked against the night sky. Cleveland General Hospital is a 7-story Art Deco building that takes up nearly an entire city block. Even in the darkness, you could see the ornate stonework around the windows, the decorative cornices, and the large cross that still adorns the roof. But there was something else about the building that night, something that made my skin crawl the moment I saw it. "Are you guys seeing this?" Sarah whispered as we sat in the car, staring at the building. I knew exactly what she meant. While most of the hospital was completely dark, there were several windows on different floors that seemed to have a faint, flickering light coming from inside. Not the steady glow of electric lights, but something that pulsed and danced like candlelight or fire. "Probably just reflections from the street lights," Marcus said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. We parked about a block away and made our way to the hospital on foot. The October air was cold and damp, with that smell that comes right before it rains. As we approached the fence, I noticed that the usual sounds of the city, traffic, sirens, people talking, seemed muffled and distant. It was as if the hospital existed in its own bubble of silence. The hole in the fence was larger than I'd expected, easily big enough for us to slip through without having to crawl. As we made our way across the parking lot toward the loading dock, I kept glancing up at those flickering lights in the windows. They seemed to be moving from room to room, always staying just ahead of us. Comment below what you think those lights could have been, because what we discovered inside was far worse than any explanation I could have imagined. The loading dock area was littered with old medical equipment, rusted gurneys, broken wheelchairs, and what looked like the remains of an old X-ray machine. The smell hit us immediately, a mixture of mold, decay, and something else. Something sweet and sickly that I later realized was the lingering odor of disinfectant mixed with something far more sinister. Marcus had been to the hospital once before, about 6 months earlier, so he knew how to get inside. There was a service door near the loading dock that had been pried open and never properly secured. As we approached the door, Sarah grabbed my arm. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. We all stopped and listened. At first, there was nothing but the sound of wind rattling through broken windows somewhere above us. Then we heard it, a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to be coming from inside the building. It sounded almost like machinery, but with organic quality that made it seem almost alive. "It's probably just the heating system," Marcus said. "These old buildings make all kinds of weird noises." But as we stood there listening, the sound stopped abruptly, as if whatever was making it had suddenly become aware of our presence. The service door opened with a long, drawn-out creak that echoed through the empty corridors beyond. Marcus switched on his flashlight and stepped inside first, followed by Sarah, then me. The beam of light revealed a long hallway lined with doors, most of which were standing open. The walls were covered in peeling paint and graffiti left by previous explorers, and the floor was littered with debris, broken glass, chunks of plaster, and papers that rustled under our feet. "This is the basement level," Marcus explained in a whisper. "Storage rooms, laundry facilities, the morgue. The patient areas are on the upper floors." The morgue. I hadn't really thought about the fact that we'd be exploring a place where dead bodies had been kept. The idea made my stomach churn, but I pushed the feeling aside. We were here to document the building's architecture and history, not to let our imaginations run wild. As we made our way down the hallway, our flashlights revealed glimpses of the rooms we passed. Most were empty, but some still contained remnants of the hospital's past. Old filing cabinets, broken medical equipment, and in one room, what appeared to be an old autopsy table with leather restraints still attached. "Jesus," Sarah muttered, shining her light on the restraints. "What kind of procedures did they do here?" None of us had an answer to that question, but something about those restraints made me deeply uncomfortable. They weren't just medical restraints. They were heavy, industrial-looking things that seemed designed to hold someone who was fighting with incredible strength. We found the stairwell at the end of the hallway. It was a narrow, concrete affair with metal handrails that were slick with condensation. As we climbed to the first floor, our footsteps echoed in the enclosed space, creating a rhythmic sound that seemed to be answered by similar echoes from somewhere else in the building. The first floor was where the main entrance, reception area, and administrative offices were located. The lobby was surprisingly large, with a high ceiling and what had once been an elegant reception desk. Even in its current state of decay, you could see that Cleveland General had been an impressive facility in its heyday, but there was something wrong with the lobby. It took me a moment to figure out what it was. Then I realized it was too clean. Not clean in the sense that someone had been maintaining it, but clean in the sense that there was no graffiti, no debris, no sign that other explorers had ever been there. It was as if the building itself had been protecting this space from intrusion. "This is weird," Sarah said, echoing my thoughts. "Where's all the vandalism? Every other abandoned place I've been to has been completely trashed." Marcus was examining the reception desk with his flashlight. "Maybe this area is harder to access from the outside," he suggested, "or maybe people just don't make it this far." That second possibility sent a chill down my spine. What would prevent other explorers from making it to the lobby? We spent about 10 minutes photographing the lobby and the adjacent offices. The administrative areas were more typical of what you'd expect in an abandoned building. Overturned furniture, scattered papers, broken windows. But even here, the damage seemed selective. It was as if someone or something had been very careful about what they disturbed. Subscribe if you want to hear more terrifying true stories, because what happened on the second floor is when things started to get really strange. The second floor housed the general medical wards, rooms where patients had recovered from surgeries, received treatment for illnesses, and in many cases, died. The hallway was longer than the basement corridor, with patient rooms on both sides. Most of the doors were closed, which immediately struck me as odd. Why are all the doors closed? I asked Marcus. In most abandoned buildings, doors are left open or removed entirely. Maybe the hospital staff closed them when they left, he suggested. But he didn't sound convinced. We decided to explore the rooms systematically, starting with the ones near the stairwell. The first room we entered was a standard patient room. 2 beds, a small bathroom, and a window that looked out over the parking lot. The beds were still made, with hospital linens that had yellowed with age, but were otherwise intact. "This is too preserved," Sarah said, taking photos of the room. "It's like they just walked away and left everything exactly as it was." The second room was similar, but there was something different about it. The beds were unmade, and there were personal items scattered on the nightstands, reading glasses, a water cup, what looked like a rosary. But what caught my attention was the window. While the window in the first room had been clear, this one was covered in condensation from the inside, as if someone had been breathing on it recently. I approached the window and wiped away some of the condensation with my sleeve. What I saw made my blood run cold. Someone had traced letters in the condensation, S-A-V-E-U-S. "Guys," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper, "you need to see this." Marcus and Sarah rushed over to look at the window. The letters were faint but clearly visible, and they appeared to be fresh. The condensation around them was still wet. "That's impossible," Marcus said. "This building has been abandoned for over a decade. There's no way someone could have written that recently." But even as he spoke, we watched the letters slowly fade as the condensation evaporated. Within a minute, they were gone completely, leaving no trace that they had ever existed. "Did you get a photo?" I asked Sarah. She shook her head. "It happened too fast. I didn't think to take a picture." We stood there in silence for a moment, trying to process what we'd just seen. Then, from somewhere down the hall, we heard the sound of a door closing. Not slamming, but closing slowly and deliberately, the way you might close a door if you were trying not to wake someone. "Hello?" Marcus called out. "Is someone there?" The only response was silence, but it was a heavy silence that seemed to press down on us from all sides. We made our way back into the hallway, shining our flashlights in both directions. All the doors that had been closed when we arrived were still closed, but somehow the hallway seemed different, longer, darker. We continued our exploration, but the atmosphere had changed. Where before there had been the normal nervousness you'd expect when exploring an abandoned building, now there was something else. A sense of being watched, of not being alone in the building. The third room we entered was where things took a truly terrifying turn. It was a larger room, what had probably been a surgical recovery room based on the equipment that was still there. But this room wasn't empty. In one of the beds, there was a figure lying under the covers. Let me know in the comments if you've ever encountered something like this, because I'm still not sure what we were looking at. The figure was human-shaped, but completely motionless. The covers were pulled up to what would have been the neck, and we could see the outline of a head on the pillow. But there was something wrong with the proportions. The head was too large, and the body under the covers seemed oddly deflated, like a balloon that had been partially emptied. "Is that a person?" Sarah whispered. None of us wanted to get closer, but we had to know. Marcus stepped forward slowly, his flashlight beam focused on the figure. As he got closer, we could see that whatever was under the covers wasn't moving at all. No rise and fall of breathing, no small movements that you'd expect from a sleeping person. "I think it's just old bedding," Marcus said, but his voice was shaking. "Sheets and pillows arranged to look like someone's sleeping." He reached out to pull back the covers, and that's when everything went wrong. The moment his hand touched the blanket, the figure sat up. I'm not talking about a gradual sitting up, like someone waking from sleep. I'm talking about a violent, jerky movement, like a puppet being yanked upright by its strings. The head turned toward us, and in the beam of Marcus's flashlight, we could see that there was no face, just a smooth gray surface where features should have been. All three of us screamed and ran. We didn't stop to think, didn't try to rationalize what we'd seen. We just ran, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we sprinted down the hallway toward the stairwell. Behind us, we could hear something following. Not footsteps, but a dragging sound, like something being pulled across the floor. And underneath that, a sound that I can't even describe, a low moaning that seemed to come from everywhere at once. We reached the stairwell and started climbing, taking the steps 3 at a time, but the sounds behind us were getting closer, and now there were more of them. The dragging sound had been joined by what sounded like wheels rolling across the floor, and the moaning had become a chorus of voices, all crying out in what sounded like pain or desperation. "Don't stop!" Marcus shouted as we reached the 3rd floor. "Keep going!" But Sarah had stopped on the 3rd floor landing, her flashlight pointed down the hallway. "Look," she said, her voice filled with terror. The 3rd floor hallway was filled with figures, dozens of them, all standing motionless in the corridor. They were wearing hospital gowns, and they all had the same featureless faces we'd seen in the recovery room. But these weren't lying down, they were standing, facing us, as if they'd been waiting for us to arrive. "We need to get out of here," I said, but even as I spoke, I realized we had a problem. The sounds from below were getting louder, which meant whatever was chasing us was still coming up the stairs. And now the hallway above us was blocked by these things. Comment below what you think we should have done, because in that moment I honestly thought we were going to die in that hospital. Marcus made the decision for us. "The 4th floor," he said. "We'll go to the 4th floor and find another way down." The 4th floor was the psychiatric ward. Under normal circumstances, that would have been the last place I'd want to go in an abandoned hospital, but nothing about this night was normal. We continued up the stairs, and as we climbed, the sounds behind us gradually faded, but the silence that replaced them was almost worse. The 4th floor was different from the others. The moment we stepped into the hallway, we could feel it. The air was thicker, heavier, and there was an oppressive feeling that made it hard to breathe. The walls were covered in padding, the kind you'd see in a mental health facility, but much of it had been torn away, revealing the concrete underneath. "This is the psychiatric ward," Marcus explained unnecessarily. "Patients with severe mental illness were treated here. The rooms on this floor were different too. Instead of regular patient rooms, these were cells, heavy metal doors with small windows, most of which were covered by steel plates. The few windows that weren't covered revealed rooms that were barely large enough for a single bed. "Isolation rooms," Sarah said, reading from a faded sign on the wall, "for patients who posed a danger to themselves or others." And as we made our way down the hallway, examining the isolation rooms, I noticed that many of the doors were scratched and dented from the inside, as if patients had tried to claw or beat their way out. The scratches were deep, gouged into the metal, and some of them looked almost like letters or symbols. We were about halfway down the hallway when we came to room 237. The door was different from the others. It was newer, with a more modern locking mechanism, and there was a small placard next to it that read, "Experimental Treatment Room, Authorized Personnel Only." "What kind of experimental treatments?" Sarah asked. None of us had an answer to that question, but something about room 237 made me deeply uncomfortable. There was a coldness emanating from the room, a chill that seemed to seep through the metal door and into the hallway. Marcus tried the door handle. It was locked, but the lock was old and corroded. With a little effort, he managed to force it open. Share this video with someone who loves horror stories, because what we found in room 237 will haunt me for the rest of my life. The room was small, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, with padded walls and no windows, but it wasn't empty. In the center of the room was a chair, not a regular chair, but something that looked like a cross between a dental chair and an electric chair. It was made of metal and leather, with straps and restraints at the arms, legs, and chest. But what made it truly horrifying was the device attached to the headrest. It looked like some kind of helmet or crown, made of metal and covered in wires. The wires led to a control panel on the wall, which was covered in switches, dials, and gauges. Even in the dim light of our flashlights, we could see that some of the switches were in the on position. "What the hell is that thing?" Sarah whispered. I had no idea, but looking at it made me feel sick. This wasn't medical equipment. This was a torture device. And based on the dark stains on the chair and the scratches on the walls around it, it had been used. "We need to get out of here," I said, but as I turned to leave, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The control panel on the wall was glowing, not brightly, but there was definitely a faint electrical hum coming from it, and several of the gauges were showing readings. "Is that thing on?" Marcus asked. Before any of us could answer, the chair began to move. Not a lot, just a slight rotation, as if someone invisible was sitting in it and shifting their weight. Then the helmet device began to lower, slowly descending toward the seat of the chair. We ran. For the second time that night, we ran without thinking, without trying to understand what we were seeing. We just ran, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we sprinted down the hallway toward the stairwell. But this time, we weren't alone. As we ran, doors began opening on both sides of the hallway, not swinging open but sliding open with the mechanical precision of automatic doors. And from each room, figures began emerging. They moved slowly, deliberately, and they all seemed to be converging on our position. These weren't like the faceless figures we'd seen on the 3rd floor. These were different, more human, but somehow more terrifying. They were wearing hospital gowns, but the gowns were stained and torn. Some of them had visible injuries, bandages covering their heads, limbs that bent at impossible angles, faces that were partially obscured by surgical masks, and they were all reaching for us. We reached the stairwell and started down, but the figures were following us. They moved with surprising speed, and their feet made no sound on the stairs. It was as if they were floating just above the ground, gliding down the stairwell in pursuit. "The basement!" Marcus shouted. We came in through the basement. We flew down the stairs past the 3rd floor, where the hallway was now empty, past the 2nd floor, past the 1st floor, and into the basement. But when we reached the basement level, we found that the hallway had changed. The corridor that had led us to the stairwell was now a dead end, blocked by a concrete wall that definitely hadn't been there before. "This is impossible," Sarah said, shining her flashlight on the wall. "We just came from this direction an hour ago." The wall was solid concrete, with no sign that it had been recently constructed. It looked like it had been there for decades, as if the hallway had always ended at this point. Behind us, we could hear the figures descending the stairs. They were getting closer, and we were trapped with nowhere to go. That's when I noticed the door. It was set into the wall to our right, partially hidden behind a stack of old equipment. It was a heavy metal door with no markings or signs, but it was our only option. Marcus grabbed the handle and pulled. The door swung open, revealing a narrow corridor that we definitely hadn't seen during our initial exploration. The corridor was lined with pipes and electrical conduits, and it seemed to curve away into darkness. "Where does this go?" Sarah asked. "I don't know," Marcus replied, "but it's better than staying here." We entered the corridor, and Marcus pulled the door shut behind us. Immediately, the oppressive atmosphere of the hospital seemed to lift slightly. The air was cleaner, and the overwhelming sense of being watched diminished. The corridor was narrow, just wide enough for us to walk single file. It curved to the left, then to the right, then descended at a steep angle. We had no idea where we were going, but the alternative was facing whatever was pursuing us in the hospital. After what felt like an eternity, we saw light ahead. Not electric light, but natural light. The pale grey light of dawn. We had been in the hospital for over 6 hours, though it had felt like much longer. The corridor ended at a grate that opened onto a drainage ditch about a quarter mile from the hospital. We climbed out, exhausted and shaken, and made our way back to our car. As we drove away, I looked back at Cleveland General Hospital. It looked different in the morning light, less imposing, more like just another abandoned building. But I knew better. I knew what was inside that building, and I knew we had been incredibly lucky to escape. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss any supernatural content, because what happened after we left the hospital was almost as terrifying as what we experienced inside. We drove back to my apartment in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. It wasn't until we were sitting in my living room, drinking coffee and trying to process what had happened, that we began to talk about our experience. "Did that really happen?" Sarah asked. "Or did we all have some kind of shared hallucination?" I wanted to believe it had been a hallucination. I wanted to believe that there was a rational explanation for everything we'd seen. But I knew better. The scratches on Marcus's arm from when he'd scraped against the rough concrete wall were real. The photos Sarah had taken were real. And the overwhelming sense of terror we'd all felt was definitely real. "We need to research this place," I said. "Find out what really happened there." Over the next few days, we did exactly that. What we discovered made everything we'd experienced even more disturbing. Cleveland General Hospital had indeed been a regular medical facility for most of its existence. But during the 1980s and 1990s, the psychiatric ward had been the site of experimental treatments that would be considered torture by today's standards. Patients with severe mental illness had been subjected to electroshock therapy, lobotomies, and other procedures that were designed to cure them of their conditions. The hospital had been investigated multiple times by state authorities, but each investigation had been mysteriously dropped. Patients had died under suspicious circumstances, and several staff members had reported strange occurrences in the psychiatric ward. Sounds of crying and screaming from empty rooms, equipment that operated by itself, and patients who claimed to see deceased former patients in their rooms. The experimental treatment room, room 237, had been the site of the most disturbing procedures. According to records we found in old newspaper archives, at least 12 patients had died in that room between 1987 and 1995. The official cause of death was always listed as complications from treatment, but medical experts who reviewed the cases said the injuries were consistent with electrical burns and severe trauma. The hospital had finally been shut down in 2008, but not due to financial difficulties, as we'd initially thought. It had been closed after a final investigation revealed evidence of ongoing patient abuse and medical malpractice. But our research revealed something else, something that made me question whether we had actually escaped the hospital at all. The drainage corridor we had used to exit the building didn't exist. According to the original blueprints and construction records, There was no tunnel or corridor leading from the basement to the outside. The area where we had emerged was solid ground with no drainage system or utility tunnels. "So how did we get out?" Sarah asked when we compared our experience to the building plans. None of us had an answer to that question, but I was beginning to suspect that something in the hospital had wanted us to leave. Something had shown us a way out that shouldn't have existed, and I wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. Let me know if you want me to investigate this further, because what happened in the weeks after our exploration convinced me that we hadn't left the hospital's influence behind. The first sign that something was wrong came 3 days after our exploration. I was at home, editing the photos Sarah had taken, when I noticed something strange. In several of the photos, there were figures that we hadn't seen while we were in the hospital. Shadowy shapes in the background, faces in windows, and in one photo of the psychiatric ward hallway, a clear image of someone standing in the doorway of room 237. The figure was wearing a hospital gown and appeared to be a woman, but her face was obscured by what looked like the helmet device we'd seen in the experimental treatment room. She was reaching toward the camera, and her mouth was open as if she was screaming. I called Marcus and Sarah immediately. Neither of them had noticed the figure when they'd reviewed the photos, but when I showed them the image, they both became visibly upset. "That's impossible," Marcus said. "There was no one in that doorway when Sarah took that photo." But the figure was clearly visible in the digital image, and when I examined the photo more closely, I could see that she was wearing a hospital bracelet with a name and number. Helen Morrison, 237, 1987. JG, a quick internet search revealed that Helen Morrison had been a patient at Cleveland General Hospital. She had been admitted to the psychiatric ward in 1987 for treatment of severe depression and schizophrenia. According to the records, she had died during an experimental procedure in room 237 on October 13th, 1987. October 13th, the same date we had explored the hospital. The coincidence was too much to ignore. We had visited the hospital on the 30th anniversary of Helen Morrison's death, and she had somehow appeared in our photographs. But that was just the beginning. Over the next week, all three of us began experiencing strange phenomena. Marcus reported hearing whispers in his apartment at night, always coming from the direction of his bedroom closet. Sarah said she kept seeing shadows moving in her peripheral vision, and she had found her apartment door unlocked on several occasions, even though she was certain she had locked it. As for me, I began having dreams about the hospital. Not nightmares exactly, but vivid dreams where I was walking through the corridors, entering rooms, and encountering the patients who had died there. The dreams were so realistic that I would wake up feeling exhausted, as if I had actually been there all night. But the most disturbing thing was that the dreams were always the same. I would enter the hospital through the service door, just as we had done that night, but I would be alone. I would explore the building room by room, and in each room, I would encounter one of the patients who had died there. They would tell me their stories, describe their treatments, and beg me to help them find peace. The dreams always ended the same way. I would find myself in room 237, standing next to the chair with the helmet device. Helen Morrison would be sitting in the chair, and she would tell me that I needed to come back to the hospital. She would say that she and the other patients were trapped there, and that they needed someone from the outside world to help them move on. "You have to come back," she would say. "You have to help us. We've been waiting so long." Then I would wake up, and the feeling that I needed to return to the hospital would be overwhelming. It wasn't just curiosity or a desire to understand what had happened. It was a compulsion, a need that felt as essential as breathing. I tried to resist it. I told myself that going back to the hospital would be dangerous, that whatever was there had already affected us enough. But the dreams became more frequent and more vivid, and the compulsion grew stronger. Finally, after 2 weeks of sleepless nights and constant anxiety, I made a decision. I was going back to Cleveland General Hospital, but this time I was going alone. I didn't tell Marcus or Sarah about my plan. I knew they would try to stop me, and I wasn't sure I could resist the compulsion if they did. The need to return to the hospital had become so strong that it was affecting my ability to function in daily life. I went on a Tuesday night, exactly 2 weeks after our original exploration. I brought the same equipment, flashlights, camera, first aid kit, but I also brought something else. I had purchased a digital audio recorder, hoping to capture evidence of the voices I had been hearing in my dreams. The hospital looked different when I arrived. The building seemed somehow smaller, less imposing than it had been on our first visit. The flickering lights in the windows were gone, and the overall atmosphere was less oppressive. I made my way to the service door and entered the building. The basement hallway was exactly as I remembered it, but there was no feeling of being watched or followed. I climbed the stairs to the first floor, then the second, then the third, and finally to the fourth floor. The psychiatric ward was quiet. The isolation rooms were all closed, and there was no sign of the figures we had encountered during our first visit. I made my way to room 237 and found that the door was standing open. The experimental treatment room was empty, but the chair and helmet device were still there. I approached the chair cautiously, and as I did, I began to hear voices. Not the threatening sounds we had heard before, but quiet, desperate whispers. "Please help us," the voices said. "We've been waiting so long. We can't leave, we can't rest." I turned on the audio recorder and began speaking. "My name is David. I'm here because I've been having dreams about this place. If there's someone here who needs help, I want to listen." The response was immediate. The voices became clearer, more distinct, and I could make out individual words and phrases. They were telling me their stories. Stories of pain, confusion, and desperation. Stories of treatments that had gone wrong, of procedures that had been more torture than healing, of lives cut short by medical experiments disguised as therapy. "Helen," I called out softly. "Helen Morrison, are you here?" The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and my breath began to fog. Then, in the chair, I saw her. She materialized slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. First, just the outline of a human form, then gradually becoming more solid and defined. Helen Morrison looked exactly as she had in the photograph I'd found, a woman in her 30s, wearing a faded hospital gown with the metal helmet device resting on her head. But her eyes were what captured my attention. They were filled with such profound sadness and desperation that I felt tears welling up in my own eyes. "You came back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew you would. I knew you could see us." "Dudu, what happened to you?" I asked, though I already suspected I knew the answer. Helen's form flickered, becoming more translucent, then solidifying again. "They said they were going to help me. Dr. Brennan said the treatment would cure my depression, would make the voices in my head stop. But it didn't cure anything, it made everything worse." As she spoke, other figures began to appear in the room. Patients from different eras, all bearing the marks of the treatments they had received. Some had bandages covering their heads, others had scars from surgical procedures, and a few showed the telltale signs of electroshock therapy, burns around their temples and a glazed look in their eyes. "The machine," Helen continued, gesturing toward the helmet device. "It didn't just send electricity through our brains, it did something else. It opened doors that should have stayed closed. It let things in that shouldn't be here." One of the other patients, a young man who couldn't have been more than 20, stepped forward. "I'm Tommy," he said. "I died in 1992. Same machine, same chair. But I didn't die from the electricity. I died from what the electricity brought with it. Comment below if you've ever felt a presence that didn't belong in our world, because what these patients told me about the machine's true purpose will change everything you think you know about the supernatural. What do you mean? I asked Tommy, though part of me dreaded the answer. The machine wasn't just for electroshock therapy, he explained. Dr. Brennan was experimenting with something else, something he called psychic amplification. He believed that mental illness was caused by an inability to properly process psychic energy, and that by amplifying a patient's psychic abilities, he could cure their conditions. Helen nodded sadly. But instead of curing us, it made us more sensitive to the other side. We could see things that others couldn't see, hear voices that others couldn't hear, and when we tried to tell the doctors, they thought we were getting worse, so they increased the treatments. The machine opened a doorway, Tommy continued, a doorway between our world and somewhere else. Every time they used it, the doorway got a little wider, and things started coming through. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. What kind of things? Before anyone could answer, the control panel on the wall began to hum with electrical energy. The gauges started moving, the switches began flipping on and off by themselves, and the helmet device began to lower toward the chair. "It's starting again," Helen said, her voice filled with terror. "The machine is trying to open the doorway. We've been fighting to keep it closed, but we're getting weaker. Every time someone visits the hospital, every time someone explores these rooms, it feeds on their fear and gets stronger." The humming grew louder, and the entire room began to vibrate. I could feel the hair on my arms, standing up from the static electricity in the air, and there was a taste in my mouth like copper pennies. "You have to stop it," Helen pleaded. "You have to destroy the machine before it opens the doorway completely. If that happens, everything that's been waiting on the other side will come through, and this hospital will become a gateway to hell itself." I looked at the control panel, trying to figure out how to shut down the machine. The switches and dials were old and corroded, and many of them were labeled with terms I didn't understand. But even as I approached the panel, I could feel something pushing back against me, a force that didn't want the machine to be turned off. "How do I stop it?" I asked. But when I turned around, Helen and the other patients were fading away. "The main power coupling," Helen's voice echoed as her form became more translucent. "Behind the panel. But be careful. It's not just electricity that powers the machine anymore. It's fed by the psychic energy of everyone who's died in this room." Din. The patients disappeared completely, leaving me alone with the increasingly active machine. The helmet device had lowered completely and was now glowing with an eerie blue light. The humming had become a roar, and I could see sparks flying from the control panel. I grabbed the edge of the metal panel and pulled. It came away easily, revealing a tangle of wires and circuits behind it. But there was something else there too, something that definitely didn't belong in any electrical system I'd ever seen. Growing through the wires like some kind of organic parasite was a mass of dark, pulsing tissue. It was connected to the electrical components, feeding off the power, and as I watched, it began to expand and contract like a beating heart. Hit the like button if this story is getting too intense, because what I discovered behind that panel was beyond anything I could have imagined. The organic mass was covered in what looked like veins, and I could see some kind of fluid flowing through them. But it wasn't blood. It was something darker, thicker, and it seemed to glow with its own internal light. As I stared at it, I realized that this wasn't just some kind of biological growth. It was alive, and it was aware of my presence. The mass pulsed faster, and the machine's activity increased in response. The helmet device began to spin, creating a whirlwind of electrical energy that filled the room with an otherworldly light. And in that light, I could see something that made my blood run cold. The doorway that Helen had spoken about was opening. It appeared as a crack in the air itself. a jagged tear in reality that revealed glimpses of something beyond our world. Through the crack I could see shapes moving, things that might have once been human but had been twisted and corrupted by whatever force existed on the other side. "No," I whispered, reaching for the organic mass. "I have to stop this." The moment my fingers touched the pulsing tissue, I was overwhelmed by a rush of images and sensations. I saw the hospital as it had been during its operational years, the patients, the staff, the procedures, but I also saw something else. I saw Dr. Brennan, the man who had created the machine, and I understood what he had really been trying to do. Dr. Brennan hadn't been trying to cure mental illness. He had been trying to create a gateway to another dimension, a place where the boundaries between life and death, between sanity and madness, didn't exist. He had used the patients as test subjects, not for their benefit, but to power his machine with their psychic energy. The organic mass I was touching was Dr. Brennan himself, or what was left of him. He had somehow merged with his machine, becoming a living conduit for the energy that powered the doorway. And he had been feeding on the fear and psychic energy of everyone who had died in the hospital, growing stronger with each passing year. "You can't stop me," a voice whispered in my mind. It was Dr. Brennan's voice, but distorted and filled with malevolent intelligence. "I've been working on this for decades. The doorway is almost complete. Soon, the barriers between worlds will collapse, and humanity will finally understand what lies beyond death." I pulled my hand away from the organic mass, but it was too late. The contact had given Dr. Brennan access to my mind, and I could feel him trying to take control of my thoughts and actions. "You're going to help me," he continued. "You're going to bring others here, feed them to the machine until the doorway is wide enough for my masters to come through." The crack in the air was getting wider, and I could see more shapes moving on the other side. They were getting closer, pressing against the barrier that separated our worlds. And I knew that if the doorway opened completely, these things would pour through and spread across the earth like a plague. I fought against Dr. Brennan's influence, forcing myself to think clearly despite the psychic assault. The machine had to be destroyed. But I realized that simply cutting the power wouldn't be enough. The organic mass had become the machine's true power source, and as long as it existed, the doorway would continue to open. Subscribe to my channel if you want to see how this terrifying encounter ends, because what I had to do next required a level of courage I didn't know I possessed. I reached into my backpack and pulled out the first aid kit. Inside was a small bottle of rubbing alcohol and a lighter I'd brought for emergencies. If Dr. Brennan's organic form was truly alive, then perhaps fire would be enough to destroy it. I doused the mass with alcohol, and immediately the psychic pressure in my mind intensified. Dr. Brennan was fighting back, trying to stop me from carrying out my plan. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I could see my breath forming clouds of vapor in the air. "You don't understand, Doctor." Brennan's voice screamed in my head. "What's coming through that doorway isn't evil. It's evolution. Humanity is about to take the next step in its development, and I am going to be the one to guide them." I flicked the lighter, and the flame danced in the electrical storm that was raging around the machine. The organic mass seemed to recoil from the light, pulsing faster and more irregularly. "The patients who died here," I said aloud, hoping that Helen and the others could hear me, "they're not gone. They're trapped in that thing, feeding it with their energy. If I destroy it, maybe they can finally be free." I touched the flame to the alcohol-soaked mass, and the reaction was immediate and violent. The organic tissue caught fire, but instead of burning like normal organic matter, it writhed and screamed, actually screamed with a sound that was both audible and psychic. The machine went haywire. Sparks flew from every surface, the helmet device spun wildly, and the crack in the air began to fluctuate, widening and narrowing erratically. Through the doorway, I could see the shapes on the other side becoming more agitated, pressing harder against the barrier. "What have you done?" Dr. Brennan's voice was weaker now, filled with pain and rage. "You've destroyed everything I worked for. Decades of research, hundreds of test subjects, all for nothing." But even as he spoke, I could see the doorway beginning to close. The crack in the air was sealing itself, and the shapes on the other side were being pulled back into whatever dimension they had come from. The organic mass continued to burn, and as it did, I began to see the faces of the patients who had died in the hospital. They appeared briefly in the flames, their expressions peaceful for the first time. Helen Morrison was the last face I saw, and she smiled at me before fading away completely. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the dying sounds of the machine. "We're free now. We can finally rest." The fire consumed the last of the organic mass, and the machine finally went silent. The electrical storm subsided, the helmet device stopped spinning, and the crack in the air sealed completely, leaving no trace that it had ever existed. I stood in the dark room, breathing heavily, trying to process what had just happened. The machine was dead, the doorway was closed, and the patients who had been trapped in the hospital for decades were finally at peace. But I knew that my ordeal wasn't over. I had to get out of the hospital, and I had to make sure that no one else would ever be able to activate the machine again. Let me know in the comments if you think I did the right thing, because the consequences of my actions would follow me for weeks to come. I made my way out of room 237 and back into the hallway. The psychiatric ward was completely quiet now. No whispers, no strange sounds, no feeling of being watched. It was as if the hospital had finally accepted that its dark chapter was over. As I walked toward the stairwell, I noticed that the isolation room doors were all standing open. I shined my flashlight into a few of them, and I was surprised to see that they were clean. Not just free of debris, but actually clean, as if someone had recently scrubbed them down. I made my way down to the basement and found the service door exactly where we had left it. But as I stepped outside into the cool night air, I realized that something had changed. The oppressive atmosphere that had surrounded the hospital was gone, replaced by something that felt almost peaceful. I walked back to my car and drove home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not by something malevolent as I had felt in the hospital, but by something grateful. It was as if the spirits of the patients who had died there were saying goodbye, thanking me for giving them the peace they had been denied for so long. Over the next few days, I researched everything I could find about Dr. Brennan and his experiments. What I discovered confirmed everything I had experienced in the hospital. Dr. Marcus Brennan had been a brilliant but unstable psychiatrist who had become obsessed with the idea of using technology to access other dimensions. His experiments had begun innocently enough, simple electroshock therapy designed to treat severe depression and schizophrenia. But as his research progressed, he had become convinced that mental illness was actually a form of psychic sensitivity, and that by amplifying this sensitivity, he could open doorways to other realms of existence. The medical board had tried to shut down his experiments multiple times, but Dr. Brennan had powerful connections and unlimited funding from sources that were never fully disclosed. He had continued his work in secret, using the most vulnerable patients as test subjects for increasingly dangerous procedures. The official records showed that Dr. Brennan had died in 1995, apparently from a heart attack while working late in his laboratory. But the truth, as I now knew, was far more sinister. He had merged himself with his machine, becoming a living conduit for the psychic energy he had been trying to harness. For over 2 decades, he had been feeding on the fear and psychic energy of the hospital's former patients, growing stronger and working toward his ultimate goal, opening a permanent doorway between our world and the dimension he had glimpsed in his experiments. But what were the things I had seen on the other side of that doorway? What had Dr. Brennan been trying to bring into our world? I found the answer in a journal that had been donated to the Cleveland Historical Society after Dr. Brennan's death. The journal contained his private notes and observations, written in a code that took me days to decipher. Share this video with someone who loves supernatural mysteries, because what Dr. Brennan had discovered about the nature of reality itself will change how you think about the world around us. According to his notes, Dr. Brennan had made contact with entities from a parallel dimension, beings that existed in a state between life and death, between sanity and madness. These entities had promised him power and knowledge in exchange for opening a doorway that would allow them to enter our world. But Dr. Brennan had been deceived. The entities weren't interested in sharing power or knowledge. They wanted to consume our reality, to merge our dimension with theirs and create a new existence where the normal laws of physics and biology no longer applied. The patients who had died during Dr. Brennan's experiments had become aware of this plan, and they had been fighting to prevent the doorway from opening. But they were weakened by their deaths and by the psychic energy that was being drained from them by the machine. When I had destroyed the organic mass that Dr. Brennan had become, I had not only freed the trapped patients, but also sealed the doorway permanently. The entities on the other side would never be able to break through to our world, and the hospital would finally be free of the supernatural presence that had haunted it for decades. But my actions had consequences that extended beyond the hospital. In the weeks following my encounter with Dr. Brennan, I began to notice that my sensitivity to supernatural phenomena had increased dramatically. I could sense spirits in places where others felt nothing, and I could sometimes hear the thoughts and emotions of people who had died in traumatic circumstances. At first, this increased sensitivity was overwhelming. I would walk into a room and immediately know if someone had died there or if there was some kind of unresolved spiritual energy present. Old buildings, antique objects, even certain photographs would trigger psychic impressions that left me emotionally drained. But as time went on, I began to understand that this sensitivity was a gift, a way of helping spirits who were trapped between worlds, just as the patients at Cleveland General Hospital had been trapped. I started visiting other reportedly haunted locations, not as an urban explorer seeking thrills, but as someone who could potentially help lost souls find peace. I've been to dozens of locations since then. Houses where murders had occurred, hospitals where patients had suffered, schools where tragedies had taken place. In each location, I've encountered spirits who were trapped by their own trauma, unable to move on to whatever comes after death. And in each case, I've been able to help them find the peace they were seeking. The experience at Cleveland General Hospital changed my life in ways I never could have imagined. It showed me that there are forces in our world that most people never see or understand, and that sometimes ordinary people are called upon to confront these forces and restore balance. Comment below if you've ever felt called to help spirits who are trapped between worlds, because I believe that more people have this sensitivity than they realize. But my story doesn't end with my escape from the hospital. About a month after my encounter with Dr. Brennan, I received a phone call from someone who claimed to be a representative of a government agency I'd never heard of. "Mr. Thompson," the voice said, "we understand that you recently had an encounter with some unusual phenomena at Cleveland General Hospital. We'd like to speak with you about what you experienced." I was immediately suspicious. I hadn't told anyone outside of Marcus and Sarah about what had happened in the hospital, and I certainly hadn't reported it to any government agencies. "Who is this?" I asked. "My name is Agent Rodriguez," the voice replied. "I work for a department that investigates unusual occurrences, things that fall outside the normal parameters of law enforcement or scientific inquiry. We've been monitoring the situation at Cleveland General Hospital for some time. and we're aware that something significant occurred there recently. Agent Rodriguez wanted to meet with me, but I declined. I had no interest in becoming involved with government agencies, especially ones that dealt with supernatural phenomena. I had helped the trapped spirits find peace, and as far as I was concerned, that was the end of my involvement. But Agent Rodriguez was persistent. Over the next few weeks, I received several more calls, each time with offers of compensation for my consultation on similar cases. I continued to refuse, but I began to realize that there were people in positions of authority who were very interested in what I had experienced. This raised troubling questions. If the government had been monitoring Cleveland General Hospital, did that mean they knew about Dr. Brennan's experiments? Had they been aware of the supernatural phenomena occurring there? And if so, why hadn't they intervened? I decided to do some research into government involvement in paranormal research. What I discovered was disturbing. There were dozens of documented cases of government agencies conducting experiments into psychic phenomena, supernatural encounters, and attempts to weaponize paranormal abilities. Projects like MKUltra, the Stargate Project, and others had used unwitting test subjects to explore the boundaries between the natural and supernatural worlds. It was entirely possible that Dr. Brennan's experiments had been funded or overseen by government agencies that were interested in his research. The thought that the government might be involved in supernatural research made me even more determined to avoid any contact with Agent Rodriguez or his department. I changed my phone number, moved to a different apartment, and tried to maintain a low profile, but the calls continued. Agent Rodriguez seemed to have unlimited resources for tracking me down, and his offers became more generous and more insistent. Finally, I realized that I was going to have to confront this situation directly. I agreed to meet with Agent Rodriguez at a neutral location, a coffee shop in downtown Cleveland. When I arrived, I immediately recognized him as someone who had been following me for weeks. He was a middle-aged man in a dark suit with the kind of forgettable face that would blend into any crowd. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," he said as we sat down at a corner table. "I understand your reluctance to become involved with government agencies, but I think you'll find that our interests align more than you might expect." Hit that notification bell if you want to hear more about government involvement in supernatural phenomena, because what Agent Rodriguez told me about the true extent of paranormal research will shock you. "The department I work for," Agent Rodriguez continued, "was created in response to incidents like the one you experienced at Cleveland General Hospital. We investigate cases where supernatural phenomena pose a potential threat to public safety, and we work to contain or eliminate these threats." He pulled out a tablet and showed me a series of photographs. They were images of locations across the United States, hospitals, schools, government buildings, and private residences. But these weren't normal photographs. In each image, there were anomalies, strange lights, shadowy figures, and distortions that suggested the presence of supernatural activity. "These are just a few of the cases we've investigated in the past year," Agent Rodriguez explained. "Supernatural phenomena are more common than most people realize, and they're becoming more frequent. We believe that there are individuals and organizations that are actively trying to weaken the barriers between our world and others." He showed me another photograph, and I immediately recognized it. It was Cleveland General Hospital, but the image had been taken from inside the building. I could see the psychiatric ward hallway, and in the background, the door to room 237 was standing open. "We've been monitoring that location for over a decade," Agent Rodriguez said. "We knew about Dr. Brennan's experiments, and we were aware that something was building toward a critical point. But we didn't have anyone with the sensitivity necessary to enter the building and assess the situation directly." I stared at the photograph, realizing that the government had been watching the hospital the entire time. They had known about the trapped spirits, about the machine, about the doorway that Dr. Brennan was trying to open, and they had done nothing to help. "Why didn't you stop him?" I asked angrily. "If you knew what was happening, why didn't you shut down the experiments before people started dying?" Agent Rodriguez's expression didn't change. Dr. Brennan's research was useful to certain departments within the government. The potential military applications of his work were considered too valuable to interrupt. It wasn't until the supernatural activity reached critical levels that we realized the situation had become too dangerous to continue. The implication was clear. The government had been willing to let Dr. Brennan continue his experiments, even knowing that patients were dying, because they wanted to understand how to harness supernatural forces for their own purposes. "But you stopped it," Agent Rodriguez continued. "You destroyed the machine, closed the doorway, and eliminated the threat. That's exactly the kind of capability we need in our department." I stood up to leave, but Agent Rodriguez grabbed my arm. "Before you go, there's something else you should know. Dr. Brennan wasn't the only researcher working on projects like this. There are others in locations across the country who are conducting similar experiments. Some of them are government-funded, others are private ventures, but all of them pose the same kind of threat that you encountered at Cleveland General Hospital." He handed me a business card. "We can't force you to work with us, but we can offer you resources and support for the work you're already doing. You have a gift, Mr. Thompson. You can see and interact with supernatural phenomena in ways that most people can't. That makes you incredibly valuable in our line of work." I looked at the business card. It was plain white with only a phone number and the words "Department of Unusual Phenomena" printed in small black letters. "Think about it," Agent Rodriguez said. "We're not asking you to stop what you're doing. We're asking you to do it with backup, with resources, and with the knowledge that you're part of a larger effort to protect people from threats they don't even know exist." I left the coffee shop without making any commitments, but I kept the business card. Over the next few weeks, I found myself thinking about Agent Rodriguez's offer. If there were other locations like Cleveland General Hospital, other researchers like Dr. Brennan, then perhaps I did have a responsibility to get involved. But I also had to consider the possibility that working with the government might compromise my ability to help the spirits I encountered. Government agencies had their own agendas, and those agendas might not always align with what was best for the supernatural entities I was trying to help. In the end, I decided to continue working independently, but I kept Agent Rodriguez's business card as a reminder that there were forces in our world, both natural and supernatural, that most people never see or understand. Let me know if you think I made the right choice, because the decision to stay independent would lead to encounters that were even more terrifying than what I experienced at Cleveland General Hospital. Over the past 6 months, I've investigated dozens of locations across the Midwest. Each one has been different, but they all share certain characteristics. Places where human suffering has created psychic imprints, where the boundaries between life and death have become thin, and where spirits are trapped by their own trauma. I've helped ghosts find peace, I've closed doorways to other dimensions, and I've prevented supernatural entities from causing harm to the living. But I've also learned that the supernatural world is far more complex and dangerous than I initially realized. There are entities that feed on fear and suffering, beings that exist solely to cause chaos and destruction, and forces that are actively working to weaken the barriers between our world and others. The work I'm doing isn't just about helping individual spirits. It's about maintaining the balance that keeps our reality stable. The experience at Cleveland General Hospital was just the beginning of my journey into the supernatural world. Since then, I've encountered things that would make that night seem like a pleasant dream. I've faced demons that can possess the living. I've battled entities that exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. And I've discovered that there are places on Earth where the normal laws of physics simply don't apply. But I've also learned that there are others like me, people who have been touched by the supernatural world and who have dedicated their lives to protecting humanity from threats that most people can't even imagine. Subscribe to my channel if you want to hear more of these stories, because I have encounters to share that will challenge everything you think you know about reality. As I finish writing this account, I'm sitting in my apartment, looking out at the city lights of Cleveland. It's been almost a year since that night at Cleveland General Hospital, and I'm still processing everything that happened. The hospital itself was demolished 6 months ago, finally putting an end to the dark chapter of its history. But the memories of that night, the patients I met, the machine I destroyed, the doorway I helped close, those memories will stay with me for the rest of my life. They've changed who I am, what I believe, and how I understand the world around me. I've learned that there are forces in our universe that exist beyond our normal perception, and that sometimes ordinary people are called upon to confront these forces and restore balance. I've learned that death isn't always the end, and that suffering can create spiritual wounds that persist long after the physical body has died. Most importantly, I've learned that we're not alone in this universe. There are other dimensions, other forms of consciousness, and other realities that exist parallel to our own. The boundaries between these worlds are not as solid as we might think, and there are people and entities that are actively working to manipulate these boundaries for their own purposes. The story I've told you tonight is true in every detail. I know it sounds impossible, and I know that some of you will dismiss it as fiction or delusion. But I'm telling you this story because I believe that people have a right to know about the supernatural forces that exist in our world. If you've ever felt a presence in an empty room, if you've ever seen something move in your peripheral vision, if you've ever had the feeling that you're being watched by something you can't see, then you might be more sensitive to the supernatural world than you realize. Pay attention to these feelings. Trust your instincts. And if you ever find yourself in a situation where you're confronted by something that shouldn't exist, remember that you're not helpless. There are ways to protect yourself, there are ways to fight back, and there are people who can help you. The supernatural world is real, and it's closer to our everyday reality than most people know. But it's not something to fear, it's something to understand, to respect, and when necessary, to confront with courage and determination. Comment below if you've had your own supernatural encounters, because I want to hear your stories. Share your experiences. Tell me about the strange things you've seen or felt, and let's start a conversation about the hidden world that exists alongside our own. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, you're never truly alone in this world. There are forces of light and darkness, good and evil, life and death, all around us at all times.